Thank you for joining us today. Michael and I worked together on the exhibition Museet, The Mystery of the Ordinary, 1926 to 1938. And it opened at MoMA in September, and it closed just on January 12th, so a few weeks ago. And we'll be traveling to the Menil Collection in Houston, and then to the Art Institute of Chicago, and of course Chicago. So if any of you are in those cities through, let's see, next October, then you should go and see their iterations of the Museet show. When we started to work on this exhibition, we had two major goals. The first goal was to show how incredibly innovative Museet was during this 13-year period of his life. It's really when he develops his really iconic style, his major techniques, and he becomes the Museet that really everyone recognizes today as Museet. Our second goal was to show how incredibly innovative he was in the specific context of the Surrealist movement, because a lot of Museet shows were entire retrospectives, and he lived until 1967. So this was the first time that an exhibition treated this very specific time period of his life when he was involved with the Surrealist movement. So why 1926? 1926 is when Museet, again, becomes the artist that we recognize today. He later said that this is when he began to paint objects with all of their realizable detail. Before this, as some of you may know, he was working in a more cubist and futurist abstract style. And then in 1938, he gives a major lecture in Antwerp called La Ligne de Vie. And here is where he really outlines the development of his own work. He outlines the history of Surrealist painting, and he places himself within this history. And of course, right after this, World War II breaks out, the art world changes, Museet's own work changes for quite a number of years before he returns to a very realist, Surrealist-inspired style. And so we thought that this would be a good place to end the exhibition. In April 1927, Museet had a major exhibition at the Galerie Le Centaure in Brussels, and the works in this show, there were 49 paintings in 12 papier-collés. It provided the inspiration for the first area of MoMA's exhibition, and you can see this first room on the right here. And at the left foreground is a painting called The Menaced Assassin, and it, along with The Secret Player, which is part of the collection of the Royal Museum in Brussels, were two of the largest paintings in this exhibition. In an interview of 1926, Museet confirmed how important this first solo exhibition was for him. He said that it was the first time that he had truly represented what he considered of value in his work. And really, this was also the first time that his work demonstrated his experimentation with Surrealist sources, particularly Max Ernst and Giorgio de Chirico. Also, importantly, critics started recognizing him as a Surrealist at this point. Really, it was Belgian critics. He was not very well known outside of Belgium in these years. And Paul-Gustave Van Eyck, who was a well-known dealer, an editor of major avant-garde journals, and also really just this fantastic impresario of the art world. He wrote a really wonderful article on Museet where he indicates that it was this combination of the real and the unreal in Museet's work of this moment, of 1927, that was revealing the unconscious in the everyday world. And for Museet, this really became the hallmark of his style, revealing the strange, revealing the inner workings of everyday objects. And already in 1927, his Belgian colleagues were recognizing this. Immediately after this exhibition, in the summer of 1927, probably in June or July, he undertakes a major ambitious project. And it consisted of these 4 paintings, all very large-scale paintings. And we have here Untitled, The Secret Double, The Enchanted Pose, and The Phantom's Wife. And the subject of the rest of our talk today will really be this work on the upper right, The Enchanted Pose. And again, in these 1927 works, you can see a lot of his techniques that he becomes really well known for, such as doubling, displacement, transformation, metamorphosis, and framing. And these are all really things that he began working with in 1926 and continues on through the rest of his career to some extent or another. This painting, the Enchanted Pose itself, if you take a closer look at it, it's two standing female nudes leaning against a column. There's very little background, there's very little to place them in a specific time or place, and it has this, very quiet, otherworldly quality. The most innovative aspect of this particular painting was really the doubling and repetition that Magritte was working with during this time. And we had a number of paintings in MoMA's exhibition that show how he was working with doubling and repetition. One of my favorites is this work on the right from the Menil collection. It's called An End to Contemplation. And you can see here that, of course, Magritte has depicted two almost identical heads, bald heads. And what I always like to point out in this work is how, on the right side of these paintings, it's rather well modeled. There's a sense of a 3D quality, a traditional representation of the human form. But then on the left side, there's a depiction of cutting, of a type of collage, and it gives this very flat feeling to that particular side of each of these heads. Other things to note about this work are these forms in the background. In one way, it seems as if it's white paper or white form pasted on the canvas, and then it also seems as if perhaps it's a rip, as if there's been a rip in the canvas, a rip in this pictorial plane. And when you see this in person, it becomes quite obvious that these dots right here are actually snap fasteners. They are fasteners for clothing. Mostly we use them now for babies' clothing, little snaps. And they're pierced through the canvas. And this is really the only time that Magritte did something like this. So this work, and I love talking about it, not only shows this doubling and repetition, it also is showing his interest in collage at this point. One last thing to point out is the three stripes on the right, the center, and the left. And in this way, I think Magritte is indicating that it's not just two, that there's this continuum, that there's this constant repetition of images that he's thinking about during this time period. Just a little bit about the history of the Enchanted Pose itself. It was shown at another Belgian gallery, the Galerie L'Époque, in an inaugural exhibition. It was a group show in October 1927 of all modern artists, and this was Magritte's painting in the show. There are several letters that mention the painting in 1927 and 1928, and in fact, these letters lead the authors of the Catalogue Raisonné, the Magritte Catalogue Raisonné, whose names are David Sylvester and Sarah Whitfield. It led them to claim that this painting was a rather important composition for Magritte, that this is something that he greatly valued during this time period. There's no further documentary evidence of it until 1932. And then at that point, we have a letter from the secretary of the Œuvre Nationale des Beaux-Arts, which at that point held a salon every year at the Palais des Beaux-Arts. And this letter asked Magritte to pick up his painting. And apparently the painting had not been chosen. This was in 1932, so that is 5 years after it was made. It had not been chosen to be shown in this salon. After that, the painting really disappears. It's lost to history, and in fact, it's listed as whereabouts unknown in the Catalogue Raisonné, despite the fact that it was a very important composition, according to the authors. So it's only recently that we have come to understand what happened to the Enchanted Pose. And as Michael will explain to you in more detail, Magritte ultimately painted over this entire painting. Before Michael speaks to you, however, I'd like to speculate just a little about the possible reasons that Magritte may have painted over the work, and essentially, changing it, making it lost to us in its first form forever. And the first, you had a little preview of this slide. But the first reason I'd like to suggest is that it is actually quite derivative of Picasso. A lot of people, when they see this work, will say, oh, those are Picasso's figures from the 1920s. And I think you can see that very, very clearly in this particular image. There are very, very strong features. Even the hair is very similar in both of these images. The very large bodies, the enormous hands, the mammoth legs and feet, the very thick waists. These are all things that are shared between Picasso and Magritte in these images. One more that I'd like to show you to illustrate this point is the Titanic Days on the right from 1928, and this was in MoMA's show, and it was actually, again, one of my favorite paintings, along with An End to Contemplation, because it is so incredibly powerful, and I think very innovative. You have here the female form, but on the right is the man pasted onto her. And she appears to be struggling with him. She's pushing him away with this hand. His hand is on her thigh there. And her arm here, she's flailing about. There's a sense of tension, of panic. And it's reflected also in her face, this type of panic. We have an interesting glimpse into Magritte's thinking on this work. Just briefly, I want to let you know about this fascinating letter that he wrote to a friend of his in Brussels. There are 3 little drawings. The first drawing is the man running at the woman. The second is him grabbing her in really a traditional sort of depiction of someone grabbing another person. And then the third is him literally pasted onto her body in this way. Another thing to point out about this work is that at first the space seems very compressed. People often talk about Magritte's work as being, really claustrophobic, really closed in. And at first glance, this painting seems to give off that sense as well. But then if you notice in the background, the shadow of her foot does not project onto the wall. And that makes you think that, in fact, this is a void in the back. This is empty space. And part of her terror is that she's falling backwards. Now, the reason that I've gone into this painting in such detail and pointed out some of the really fascinating aspects of the Titanic Days is to suggest that the Enchanted Pose did not quite have the same sort of powerful feel to it, the same sort of experimental, interest. And that, in fact, might be one reason that Magritte ultimately decided to cut it up. I mean, it's an interesting painting. It's quite a large painting, as I pointed out to you. But really, the most interesting aspect of it is the doubling. And there were many other works that showed this in, I think, a more interesting fashion. Some other reasons that he may have cut this work up in 1932, painted over it. He was no longer working as much with doubling and repetition, so this was something that was a bit of an older technique for him. He would return to it in the late 1930s, but in 1932 or so, not as interesting for him. It had been rejected by the Salon. He had wanted to show it at the Salon, most likely wanted to sell it, and it had been rejected. So of course it was unsold. He did not have a gallery in Belgium at the time, and it was quite large. It's quite a large painting. It was taking up space. He was also, in 1935, 1936, preparing for a major solo exhibition. And as Michael will outline for you, this may have been another reason that he ultimately ended up painting over the Enchanted Pose. And so now I'm going to turn this over to Michael, and he will be able to tell you a little bit more about the specifics of MoMA's discovery.
Thanks, Danielle. Here, I'll give you that. So now that Danielle has you on the edge of your seat, so I'll continue to talk to you about the process of discovering the Enchanted Pose. And just as an introduction, this exhibition gave us the chance to study around 20 paintings from this period, 1926 to 38. And since it was a collaboration between MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Menil Collection, gave us that opportunity to really look at Magritte in depth. And this is one of my favorite pictures of Magritte in his studio working on the empty mask. And it shows you how precise he is as a painter. He's working on each section of the painting one by one, filling in these areas and working them to completion. So Magritte, The Mystery of the Ordinary, as Danielle mentioned, he gave this lecture in 1938, which summarized his work as an artist. And he said, I had acquired some knowledge of the technique of painting, and I made some experiments which differed deliberately from all aspects of the painting I knew about. I savored the pleasure of freedom in painting the more anti-conformist images. So as I mentioned, we got a chance to study in depth several paintings from MoMA's collection. There's actually 5 from this period, but it's the portrait that I really want to concentrate on for obvious reasons. So the portrait painted in 1935 in Brussels, and it measures 73 by 50 centimeters, and it's in a standard French format that artists typically use. So it's, about that big. And as part of the discovery and leading up to it, we used a lot of different scientific and imaging techniques to really study in depth the surface of the painting. And here's some of the techniques we used. I'm not going to explain each one in depth, but just let you know techniques such as X-ray fluorescence scanning, and this is a little thumbnail of the portrait actually being scanned in the MoMA Conservation Studio. And this enabled us to do pigment analysis and things like thread counting, so we know the exact kind of canvas Magritte used. Multispectral imaging, which shows us the painting under various lighting conditions, and also infrared and ultraviolet imaging. And all these techniques really give us an in-depth view of the artist's technique, which you'll see is very helpful. So first of all, examining the portrait, the first thing that happened before we did any kind of treatment is we took it out of the frame. And we immediately noticed that there was something unusual about the edges. And I'd show you a detail of the edges here. So that's the actual edge of the left side of the painting. And I think you can see it's actually the same color of the background painted entirely over the edge. And that's unusual because most Magrittes we had looked at up until that point showed the white priming layer on the edges. So this was very unusual. We also noticed that in the center, the glass, you see here, there's some unusual highlights in the glass, kind of a pinkish highlight. And this struck us also as a little bit unusual for him. The next picture I show you is the painting under ultraviolet light. And here on the left, you see it in normal lighting conditions, and then on the right, under ultraviolet light. And that's a technique that shows us not only some paint layers, different pigments, but also varnish issues, and might also point out some older restorations. But in this case, we started to see some kind of unusual patterns emerging in the background. And this was something that also struck us as unusual, but wasn't something that we could really identify. So it wasn't until we started looking into X-rays that our mysteries began to be solved. And in this case, that I'm showing you first, a work called The Song of the Storm that conservators had known for some time that showed an underlying composition. So we knew Magritte would repaint his canvases, sometimes with completely different images. And in this case, he painted The Song of the Storm over an earlier version of a portrait of Edward James. So we knew that there was a precedent for this kind of work from Magritte. So here's the portrait, and I'm showing you the X-ray now. You have to ignore all this metal in the background. That's actually part of the stretcher. But I think you'll see when you look at the X-ray, there's some other kinds of figurative kinds of elements that are showing up that don't relate to the bottle of wine, the glass, or the plate with the eye and the fork and knife. So again, using imaging techniques, we're able to enhance the X-ray and start to see more. And I'm showing you now, this is the image of the X-ray, and then when we rotated it on the side, we said, wow, this is something unusual. This wasn't what we expected at all. What we saw emerging was a female figure, and you can see her head here, and you can start to see the slope of the shoulder and the torso and some other details. So this was a very exciting discovery, and in my 20 years working at MoMA, it's really the only time we've actually had such an amazing discovery like this that was quite unexpected. Next, I'll show you the Enchanted Pose. So the question was, okay, what was this underneath? Was it a portrait that he painted over? Was it some other artist's work? We really didn't know. But after consulting with Danielle and actually a colleague from the Menil collection, they saw this comparison with the Enchanted Pose. Now, of course, this is listed in the catalog raisonné. We have this black and white photograph, but no other images of it. And it's, of course, not exactly what appears underneath the portrait, but it was similar enough to let us to move forward with our investigation. So what we did was we just compared a quarter of the Enchanted Pose with this X-ray image, which we found, and we saw that when we lined it up side by side, it looked quite promising. And there was this very close correspondence here. So there you see the Enchanted Pose, the upper left quadrant, and a portrait of the X-ray. And I've just outlined in red the contour of the figure. And with further imaging techniques, we were able to actually overlay the image on top of the image we had of the Enchanted Pose and really show a close correspondence. So we thought this was very convincing that Magritte had actually used a part of the Enchanted Pose to paint the portrait. Now the next question was, okay, so if this a quarter of the painting existing here, where are the other parts of it? So we thought maybe he cut it into 4 pieces and there would be 3 other pieces somewhere out there. Well, believe it or not, the next painting on the checklist for the exhibition, which is the same size and the same date as the portrait, is the red model from 1935. And I happen to know the conservator at the Modern Museet, and I actually ran into him and I said, we have this painting in our show called The Portrait, and it's the same size as your painting, the same date, and we found a pre-existing painting underneath. Could you look at your painting for us and see what you see? So lo and behold, the X-ray was done, and this is the image that resulted. So it's quite not quite as visible as the portrait, but you can see with some enhancing this base of the column and some other kind of shadowing here, which does correspond to actually the lower left portion of the Enchanted Pose. So I show you a detail of the Enchanted Pose on the right and the red model X-ray. And if I rotate it again to the side, you can see, I think, more clearly this kind of base of the column here and the shadow outline. And what's even more interesting is when we looked at the edges of the painting. So if you remember, we looked at the edges of the portrait and saw that it was painted. But in this case, it's painted with details that you can really see that there's something unusual underneath. So if you look at the top edge, I think you can see a little blue and some fluting that corresponds to the column, and a little more of the flesh color. And also on the side, you see blue and gray, and on the bottom, you see gray as well. And on the side, you see white and black that actually corresponds to the columns in the Enchanted Pose. So this was all very exciting evidence for us to see, and of course, led us to conclude that we had basically found half of the painting under the portrait and the red model. And here, just to give you an idea of how some of the imaging we did, so we were able to line up this detail of the edge of the red model and see how it corresponded to this cross-section in the Enchanted Pose. So you have the blue sky, you have the fluting of the column, you even have some of the fingers visible, and then more of the column. But what's interesting is Magritte actually painted out this little bit of the torso here, so he didn't entirely let it become visible. So as I mentioned before, we were able to prove the correspondence by taking images of the X-ray and overlaying them on top of this black and white image that we had from the catalog raisonné. So again, this shows you using Photoshop, basically covering the existing image with what we found in the X-ray. So that's the portrait X-ray and the red model X-ray. So what we now proven is that we found this underlying composition of the left half of this major painting from 1927. And I just wanted to point out some of the other techniques we used to get images included infrared imaging, and that typically is used in showing underdrawing in old master paintings, but in this case it showed very clearly more details in the face of the figure. I think you can see, even better than in the X-ray, you can see, whoops, details in her face, including the eyes and the shape of the nose and the lips and the ears. So this was more exciting evidence of the underlying painting. What we also were able to do was, thanks to our colleagues at the Technical University in Delft, was to borrow an X-ray scanning easel from them. This was a portable scanner that was kind of doing a tour of the US at the time. It had just been at the Getty looking at their Rembrandt paintings, and we were able to borrow it to not only scan our portrait, but also the red model. So this is a very exciting new technique, and mainly in the Netherlands. And what happens is the painting is scanned pixel by pixel. So the scan actually takes 2 days to do, because of, even on a small painting like the portrait, you get these incredible images. And these are some of the images that we had that are based on the elemental analysis of the painting. So in this case, we see the iron elements in the pigments, and you get these images that just show you iron. So you have, believe it or not, the little tacks on the edge, and then primarily iron in the shadow of the plate here, and in the knife, and also in the bottle. But see, what you can see is this shape of the face of the Enchanted Pose shining through, because Magritte actually used iron-based pigments in the flesh tones of the underlying painting. And since the bottle is transparent, it's actually made out of calcium-based pigments. We were able to see through under to the painting. So it's another technique like the X-ray that allows you to examine paintings in such great detail. So just on the right side, you see also a map of the lead-containing pigments, and here you see the corresponding detail, and we just put it on the side so it's easier to compare. And again, with this scanner, we were able to look at the lead-containing pigments, which were also a great part of both the underlying and upperlying painting, but gave us insight into the underlying composition and to see the correspondence with the Enchanted Pose. And also to look at the brushwork, to study the canvas weave, and to be able to examine it without the stretcher. So that was a great opportunity for us. And in one more just example is in the bottle, the wine bottle. Turns out that contains calcium, which is indicating a kind of bone black pigment that he used. So it not only enabled us to see the image better, but also to actually confirm some of the pigments that Magritte was using during 1927 and 1935. So they weren't very different at all. The next thing was, since we only really had this black and white image of the Enchanted Pose, we start to think more about, well, what would it look like in color? And for that, we turned to some earlier studies we had done on the Song of the Storm with the Menil collection, and trying to figure out what kind of colors he used underneath that painting. And we were able to see that through the scanner, things like this mercury, which is indicating red pigment. So we were able to actually compare the red in the tie with the red in the existing portrait of the pleasure principle, and see other details that aren't visible in the X-ray, such as the costume of the seated man, and also identify some of the blue pigments containing chromium and also other elements containing titanium. And what's also interesting to see is we know that it does correspond this kind of color, reddish color. It's a kind of a faux bois technique he used, and you can see it in other paintings from 1927. So it's an interesting way to compare the kind of pigments he's using throughout this period, 27 to 38. So the next thing was to apply everything we had learned about the underlying painting and the kind of pigment analysis that we were doing with the Enchanted Pose. And here is that, again, this only image we have is this black and white illustration from the catalog raisonné. And through working with some imaging specialists, we were able to come up with what we thought would be a kind of reconstruction of the painting in color. And of course, this is a work in progress because although we know the colors of the background, of the sky, we know the color of the floor, and we know the color of the figures based on the edges of the paintings we had studied, we don't really know what color this wall is because we haven't been able to find the missing half of the painting. So this is a little bit of conjecture, picking a color that Magritte used, a color scheme that Magritte used often in the 20s and into the 30s, is this kind of combination of brown and gray and blue. So this is an exciting way to look forward to finding the additional sections of the painting, which is something we're very much hoping to do. And there's the color reconstruction again, a work in progress, as I mentioned. And then what we've been doing is we've been looking at other paintings from after 1932 through 1938, and really concentrating on paintings that were made for the exhibition in 1936, which is a major exhibition held here in Brussels at the Palais des Beaux-Arts in the spring of 36, called René Magritte, Peinture Objet Surréaliste, and included 11 paintings that are potentially works that he could have overpainted a section of the Enchanted Pose. And two of those include the red model and the portrait. So the red model and the portrait were included in this exhibition. So we thought, well, why not concentrate on ones that are also the same size in that exhibition? So we've done that. And these are three that we've had a chance to look at in detail. Unfortunately, we've ruled them out as possibilities for the missing sections, but we still have many more to examine. So please raise your hand if you know of any missing sections out there. But these, just to give you an example of some of the paintings that the same size as the portrait and the red model, and the same format, the right year. So we have Illumination, Heraclitus Bridge, Perpetual Motion, and actually three other paintings that are possibilities. So we're here to let you know about our discovery, and also to ask you to help spread the word about this potential reconstruction of the missing half of the painting. Now, of course, it's possible that Magritte may have cut the painting in half and then in quarters, but he may also have just used one half of the painting. That's something that we have to look into as well. So there's a fair amount of speculation still about this work, but we're hoping with continued research to solve the puzzle even more. And we've had a lot of help on this project so far, and I'd just like to thank the people here, including my colleagues at MoMA, and Umland, who's the curator of the exhibition, along with Danielle Johnson here with me, and our colleagues at the Meal Collection, the Moderna Museet, and the Art Institute of Chicago especially, and people here in Europe, including Mia van der Kakova, Charlie Huskovici, Frederick Lean, our colleagues in the Netherlands who helped us with the scanning, Joris Dick, John Delaney, who did that incredible images for us of the infrared, and Tony Vargas in New York, who assisted us with the color reconstruction. And thank you for coming to hear us talk.
Pigments on the hidden painting that you detected and talked about. You picked those up from the Delft XRF scan. How did you detect that? How did you determine what they were?
Well, we were able to characterize them using the Delft scanner, but also using pigment analysis on the edges. So we had some areas that we were able to look at on the edges to actually determine what they were visually and with the scanner. So
the Delft scanner will allow you could do a trace. I mean, given enough time,
yes,
you could literally trace through and scan your way through until you've got the underlying painting
exactly.
that you're analyzing.
And that's what we were able to do with both the red model and the portrait. And we even scanned just the edge that I showed you, that showed the column and the fingers and all that. So we really were able to identify the pigments conclusively using that. So that was extremely helpful.